Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2 o'clock community session for the KubeCon Barcelona. Before we begin, I would just like to remind everybody that if you have an opportunity, please rate all of the sessions that you've attended. It's great feedback for the conference organizers and also for the speakers themselves. And it'll help to build even better content for future conferences. So our next speaker has been a critical member of the Kubernetes community since its very beginning. He founded and was lead engineer for Google Compute Engine and followed that up by co-founding Heptio. And during a Friday afternoon, he tweeted about hacking on Kubernetes. And that event later became TGIKubernetes, which is one of the most prized resources in the cloud native world. While being an accomplished developer and leader, he's also worked to advocate for the growth of developers and operators within the Kubernetes community at all levels of their career. So please, here to talk about 2 years of TGIKubernetes, please welcome the principal engineer at VMware, Joe Beda.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so let's make this as interactive as possible. I love it when I have an audience that can talk back to me. So like even you all in the back, don't be afraid to yell stuff out. That's one of the things that makes TGIK so much fun, for me at least. All right, let me start out with what is TGIKubernetes? So for those who aren't familiar, and I think most folks in the room, hopefully are, otherwise that's probably why you wouldn't be why would you be here? But every Friday, me or more times since I've gotten busy, I'll hand it off and have somebody else help out. We'll essentially pick a technology, hop on YouTube, and play with it in front of everybody to see how it works, right? Play with it and touch it and feel it and break it. And I think that, this was, somewhat in the vein of other sort of live streaming of game playing or programming. It's like seeing all the gory details of what it looks like when you actually start using these things for the first time. All right, so how did I go ahead and get started here? So we started Heptio after I left Google and goofed off for a little bit, and then Craig and I started Heptio. And when you're like a little baby startup, you are desperate for any attention you can get. And so when you get invited to do things like go to meetups and start talking, you say, yes, of course I want to come talk at your meetup. And I still try and do that as much as possible. I like to connect with folks. And so early on with Kubernetes, I got invited to speak at this meetup called Coffee Ops. And you can see there's a picture of me right there. And this is a really cool sort of DevOps meetup in Seattle. It's held out of the Chef offices where essentially they do it in the morning. So you get together and you start talking about the topics of the day du jour while you're drinking some coffee. A lot of times it's sort of more of an unconference type of thing where folks get together and sort of pick a topic and sort of form groups and start talking. But at this point they invited me to sort of give a sort of Kubernetes 101 type of presentation. And so I threw something together, and it was like an interactive demo of let's start with a container, let's deploy it to Kubernetes, let's show how we can do upgrades, let's show how load balancing continues to work through the process of an upgrade. The sort of bread and butter of what you want to do with Kubernetes. And it actually went out and ended up going really well. Their AV setup, if I remember correctly, was a little flaky, and I keep jiggling the cable every time I did something. But beyond that, it went really, really well. And I had so much fun doing it, but I'm like, that was a great audience, but it wasn't recorded, and if you happen to be in Seattle and can get there in a morning like that, you get to see stuff like this. And I really wanted to take this type of experience in a wider way. So at the same time, I was I have to make a confession. I am a YouTube addict. I don't watch as much TV anymore. I love the sort of random crawl through YouTube. I love the fact that there are people who go super deep on a particular topic. Okay, so some of my favorite YouTube channels. There's people who take old rusty pieces of machinery and tools and they refurbish them. They get rid of the rust, and you see this transformation, and it's no words, and you'll watch this for half an hour, and you're like, why did I watch that? Another one is there's this guy, his name is Gavin. He makes cheese. He's from Australia. He opens every episode with "Hello, curd nerds." I love it. It's amazing. And so this sort of deep knowledge where people are like showing you all the nitty-gritty steps of whether they're making cheese or whether they're forging knives or whether they're doing woodworking or makeup or, my daughter's into that, or slime. Have you seen the slime thing? Like this is I don't understand it, but it's a thing. If you have kids, they've probably made a huge mess doing this, and they learned it all on YouTube. And then live coding. And so we're starting to see that happen in the domain also. So one of the people that inspired me was Suze Hinton, and she's at Microsoft right now, and she goes by NoopCat or NopeCap. I don't know how she pronounces it. But she does, like every Sunday, she'll actually start live coding, doing open source stuff on Twitch. She'll be like, well, let's go through PRs and review them, and has a really friendly, laid-back community. Just sort of the day-to-day grind of like doing this stuff. She does it in public, hangs out with people, and has a ton of fun doing it. So she actually wrote a guide on some of the technology of what she does on Twitch. This was about the time I was starting TGIK that she wrote this article. There's an updated version of it also if you're interested, and she's a great resource for that. And so then finally, the other reason is that like as a startup founder, you have this dream of like, I'm just going to like sit down and write code and it's going to be awesome and it's going to be amazing. But the reality of the situation is that your time gets taken up by like everything else. Right? I mean, running a business is a lot of work, and oftentimes a lot of that work is not hands-on keyboard technical. And so I'm like, I got to carve off some time so that I can stay connected with the community, so that I can stay aware of all the new exciting things that are happening in the Kubernetes community. It's something that I'm going to have to do for my own sanity, but also for the good of the company. I might as well just do that in public in front of everybody else. And so a big part of what I'm doing is exploring stuff for the first time while everybody else is exploring it for the first time. So yeah, so I sort of like did a bare bones setup. The most production sort of quality thing I did was I started creating these like images here to use when I was doing these things, because like one of the things that as you sort of like, the other thing I learned about a startup is that like the 37 gazillion different types of marketing, why they matter and how you do them. It's actually been an enormous education to learn sort of like the ins and outs of marketing. But like one of the simple things, if you're doing any sort of social marketing, images capture people's attention. Right? You can put a tweet with a bunch of text and like it just scrolls by, but you get an image that's interesting that catches your eye. It really helps to drive interest and get people into it. And so that's why I create these title cards for every episode. So this is like, I pretty much did this, and then I got the bare bones setup for streaming. Probably did like one little small dry run, and then I just started broadcasting. And if you go back and watch the first episode, and maybe some of you have watched it, it's pretty raw. I'm kind of rambling. I'm like, can anybody hear me? Because when you're doing these things, like, you're essentially staring at a wall. You're staring at your screen, talking to yourself for like an hour and a half. It takes a certain amount of confidence to be able to do that. And so it was pretty rough, that first one. And I essentially took that demo that I did for Coffee Ops and just redid it for everybody else. And it actually turned out really well. And then I did episode 2. And you can see like, I was dreaming big, right? It's like 002, right? It's like when you're starting out something like this, you're like, I got to leave space, right? Or maybe I should have put 3 zeros in front of it. But we're up to like episode 77, so we're going to get to episode 100. I think we're going to get there, which is really exciting. So a couple of things we learned super early on is that the chat part of the interaction, which was something that I didn't really that I didn't fully realize starting out, is a critical piece of the puzzle. It gives you some of that audience, some of that interactivity that actually makes it fun, that makes it feel like you're not totally talking to a wall. And at that point, YouTube didn't capture the chat. The chat that was going on during a live stream was just ephemeral. It disappeared. So you're missing that. So I'm responding to stuff that's happening in the chat, talking about it, interacting with people, and then when you go back and watch the stream, that stuff is totally missing. And so eventually later on, like these days, YouTube does actually capture the chat and it scrolls along with it, and it's actually kind of cool. But at the time they didn't. And so I think by episode 5, I figured out enough about OBS, so that's the open broadcasting system that I'm using to do the streaming, so that I could actually reflect the chat on screen. A big benefit of that also is that if you're watching TGIK on like a TV or something like that, you actually get to see the chat versus having to have it open on a computer. And so yeah, so setting up OBS to do that chat stuff is kind of a huge hack. They have this sort of like browser source, and you take a pop out for the chat window, and then you apply a bunch of custom CSS on it, and then YouTube changes it, and the CSS breaks on you, and then like 5 minutes before the episode, you're hacking on CSS to try and get the thing working. So that's like, but I think that's a big part of actually sort of keeping that interactivity going. And then the other thing you learn really quickly when you're doing this stuff is the lag time between when you talk and when people hear it and when they can respond in chat. Like there is enough latency there that it's something that you have to train yourself to and that you have to take advantage of and work with. All right. And then the other thing that I realized that I didn't realize is that it's really a global community there. These days when I started TGIK, people say hello from all over the world, and I try and say hello back. It's a ton of fun. I don't understand how time zones work, either through code or sort of viscerally. And so I did something like, well, Friday afternoon, I want to hang out and do some stuff, not realizing that my Friday afternoon oftentimes is other people's Friday night or middle of the night or their Saturday morning even. And so it probably isn't the best time to be doing something like this. But at this point, it's kind of, maybe I should move it to Thursday, I don't know, but it wouldn't be the same. Right? Google actually went through this where Google had an all-company meeting every week called TGIF, and they would hold it at the Mountain View campus. And then they would like video broadcast around the world. And at some point, they realized that, like I did, that this is a horrible idea in a global world to do something on a Friday afternoon on the west coast of the US. And so they moved it to Thursday, but they still called it TGIF, and it just confused the hell out of everybody. All right, so I want to go through like some of the things that we learned along the way, right? So the first one is that tangents are cool. It's really good to be able to find something interesting and really just sort of dig into it, whether you're sort of like following up some detail of the project that you're looking at and going into that, or whether it's like, hey, that reminds, like I didn't plan on talking about the Google TGIF story, but like, if those things come to mind while you're talking about this, it's okay to just sort of go deep and explore that stuff. And I think that gives it some authenticity. It gives unexpected details that people, really appreciate that you wouldn't put in if you were doing something that's completely scripted. Next lesson is that it's good to be unprepared. This is kind of counterintuitive, but I think one of the things that I've heard that people like about TGIK is that things don't always go as planned. It is an exploration. I'm learning at the same time as the audience is learning, but I'm bringing my experiences along with that. And so oftentimes if you over-prepare for these things, it kind of ruins it. And so I try and do a little bit of preparation to make sure I at least know how they say the first 10 minutes is going to go. I'll make sure that, hey, I'm going to sort of have an idea of a plan of what I'm going to do, and sort of have it scoped to like, hey, is there something interesting that I can get done in an hour, hour and a half? But that's about all the preparation that I typically do. And I think if I sort of over-prepared, it would look more like a canned demo, and I think we'd lose a lot of the fun. Ask for help. I think I am not the expert in all things, and I think it's always awesome when people in the chat know more about something than I do. I love it when I learn new things, new tools, new techniques, new ways of looking at stuff from folks who are actually tuning in. And I think that that idea that nobody's an expert in everything is actually an important thing in our engineering culture to actually get across. Right, I'll tell you something, like I did for the Kubernetes Up and Running book, I did a sample application that was like, it was a Go back end, and I'm like, let's do some JavaScript, right? And so I did like a React front end. Oh man, that was hard. I'm a total dummy when it comes to that stuff. And so yeah, like being willing to admit that you don't know and ask for help, I think is a big part of it also. And then also sometimes I'll the project that I'm actually covering, one of the authors or one of the sort of power users will actually be in the chat helping out also, and that's always a lot of fun to do too. You can make mistakes. I think we touched on this a little bit, but like if I screw something up, I have to figure out how to dig myself out of that hole, and I got to do it in front of a live studio audience. It's high pressure. I mean, there's times where you start sweating. You're like, oh man, am I going to be able to recover this? But it also it really I think makes people feel like, hey, you know, that happens to me too. I get stuck. I do the wrong thing. I skip a step when I'm going through a tutorial and have to figure out why it's going wrong because I glanced over it, right? Like that type of thing I think is a big part of learning together about this stuff. And then stay kind about this stuff. So a lot of times I'm looking at open source projects. They've just been released. There's people who put, you know, months or years of their lives into this. It's their sort of their pride and joy. It's their baby. And here I am sort of taking it for a drive for the first time in front of a live audience. It has gone wrong. I think, you know, I'm not going to name names, but there was one episode where I installed a system and I knew it was dangerous, but I did it anyways, and I ended up opening up essentially the UI to the world on a URL that people could see on the live stream. And then somebody in the audience, perhaps somebody in the room, went ahead and hit that thing and started launching sort of a cryptocurrency mining thing on the cluster. At the same time, I was using a small Amazon instances because, you know, we were a startup and I was cheap. And like these are the ones that are like fractional CPU where you can actually sort of blow these things out. Kubernetes works on these things. It doesn't work well, right? And so it essentially overloaded the cluster. The cluster didn't recover. The whole system was kind of horked at that point, and it made the project look really bad. And so I want to like give constructive feedback that's actionable to the authors of the project. I want to call out the things that I think are interesting and unique and that really capture my attention and get me excited about it. And if we hit problems, I mean, that's okay. I try and be like, hey, you know, it's bugs, it's software. We've all been there. So I think being kind about it is a big part of it also. All right, so what's our process? How do we actually do a Kubernetes, TGIK episode? I'm going to hit some of the highlights. So the first thing is that we have a GitHub repo. And we didn't do this initially. This is one of those things that we learned over time. It turns out that having a place to write stuff down is useful. And for developers, a GitHub repo is a great idea. This was inspired by a couple of longtime watchers. There's Federico, who I think was going to be here also. There he is, yeah. Started capturing some of the synopsis in, you had a GitHub repo too, right? Yeah, and so we sort of like, okay, let's make some of this official, take some of his stuff. Lamatti also, who's a longtime watcher, I don't think he's here at KubeCon. He actually had a blog post where he was doing a bunch of synopsis, taking notes. We're like, hey, let's actually create a place where folks can crowdsource this and actually share some of their sort of cliff notes from the episode. It also became a good way to actually capture ideas. And so if somebody has an idea for an episode, go ahead and open an issue in the repo. That's great. And then what I do when I pick a topic, so it's like picking candy in a candy store, right? Because there's so many great topics out there. I never know what I can do, and I always have more than I want to explore than I actually have time to. But I'll actually go through, take one of those issues and say, okay, I'm going to do this. And then we have a checklist checked in, and I take that checklist and I put it in the issue, and then make sure that we don't miss any of the steps along the way. And so, you know, if you submit one of those issues and then I take it and I start doing you might get a lot of GitHub notifications. I'm sorry. So yeah, we want to scope it so that it's something that we can get done and explore and do something interesting about an hour and a half. So one of the things that folks have asked for a lot is to actually do an episode on Kubernetes on bare metal. Like, how do I take a bare metal cluster, get it installed, get it up and running? I'd love to do that, but the logistics and the planning, how do we, and the time it takes to do that, kind of make that one a difficult thing for us to do with the TGIK format. I think that's one of those where I'd probably have to do a lot of preparation to make sure that we could present it in a way that was consumable. Yeah, and then I think as we do it, you want something where you can bring some opinion to it. Like I said, I want to be kind, but I also don't want to be like, you know, here's what it says it does, that's what it does, so there you go, right? I want to actually dig in a little bit deeper with what's going on. All right, so I mentioned the title cards before. Almost all of the images for those title cards and this presentation come from this website, Unsplash. Have you guys seen this? This thing is so much fun. So this is like Flickr, but with better curated images, and every single one of them you can use without having to attribute or worry about copyright. It's amazing. It's a really interesting community of photographers that really give this stuff away royalty-free. And there is some really cool stuff there. And so I'm so lucky I have this. It makes the job. That's like my favorite part of doing an episode, honestly, is actually exploring, trying to pick an image that relates to the topic, but isn't sort of like smacking you over the head with it. So I'll give you some examples here. So like Chris did this one. This is an episode on flannel. And you can see it's a little bit hidden by the thing here, but you can see that the woman on the dock is wearing a flannel, right? So it's a subtle hint there. What do you think this one was about? Do you remember? This one was early on. This was like, what, episode 15? This is Brigade, right? The workflow engine from Microsoft. I'm like, well, do I want to do an army thing? Oh, we'll do a fire brigade, right? So I like a firehouse, right? So it's like related. It's like my own little inside joke as I do these things. This one I did recently. This was customized. And these are a bunch of patches. And it turns out that customize, like if you look at sort of like what got it started, it's what's this idea of like, well, you have these patches that like layer on top of your YAML. And so I'm like, well, the whole thing about customize is patches. So I'll do an image with patches there. This one's contour. You can see that I like this because it looks like a contour map, but it's like a drone image of a beach showing the different contours. Oh, this one is fun. This was a really recent one. So this was OPA, the Open Policy Agent. Do you guys watch The Expanse, or have you read the books? So in The Expanse, OPA is the Outer Planetary Alliance, which is like the rebel group that's the downtrodden that like essentially, I'm not going to ruin it for you, spoilers, but like, so OPA, right? And so I'm like, I can't see the Open Policy Agent without thinking about The Expanse and OPA, so I've like put some planets up there. All right, this one's good. We have a haystack. What do you do with a haystack? You look for a needle, right? So this is Elasticsearch. And then this one's my favorite. This is Windows. And this, you start doing this, and you're like, I probably, this image is actually owned, sort of, the whole copyright is owned by Microsoft. So I'm probably violating copyright rules by doing this. I'm sorry for the folks from the Linux Foundation that maybe have to clear these things. Hopefully nobody will mind. This is a fascinating image. The Wikipedia article on this is great. It's called Bliss. The photographer just put it up on a stock photography site. Microsoft bought the rights to it and sent him a really big check. He had no idea what they were going to use it for, and it's arguably one of the most famous images out there, and it really has become synonymous with Microsoft and Windows. It's actually, I believe, in Napa Valley. And if you go to the Wikipedia page, there's examples of people who've gone to that same location and tried to recreate it and haven't come anywhere close. There's like grapevines now. So yeah, so that one is, I had to use that image, even though it wasn't from Unsplash. All right. The next thing is that it's really about teamwork. There's a lot of people that go into making this happen. So, starting out with like, the folks who send ideas that help to prep it. So a lot of times the authors of the projects, they'll be like, do you have a tutorial? Where do I start? And it's not unusual for them to be like, holy crap, over the next couple of days, we have to like rush to actually pull together something so that like there's a script that I think it benefits the project in general because I'm playing dumb like a new user, right? George Castro, you all know George if you're involved in the Kubernetes community at all. He'll actually help out a little bit also. So one of the things that he'll do is we use this tool called HackMD, and we'll talk about that early on in the episode so that people can actually sort of crowdsource notes. He'll actually get that sort of primed and ready to go. We'll use a bunch of folks on our internal Slack channel to come up with, well, what are the links? What are the interesting things that we want to actually talk about and sort of the, what happened in the Kubernetes world over the last week. And then also being able to hand it off to other members of Heptio, and maybe at some point we could hand it off to folks outside of VMware and Heptio to be able to actually, drive the bus is good also. It started out with just me doing it every week, and it was really nice to be able to lean on the team to do those. And so Chris did a bunch of them. She's no longer with us. We're gonna miss her, but. Duffy also, who's not here at KubeCon, did a bunch, and we're going to be looking for other folks who want to roll up their sleeves and get involved. All right, so technical details. What is the setup? Okay, so I mentioned OBS. OBS is actually a really, really cool project. It's this open source thing. Anybody who's doing like video game streaming, it's actually a common go-to there. It has, it's essentially like you have these scenes, and you can take all these inputs, and you can composite them on the screen, and you can fade in and out. And sometimes the inputs are like other videos or images or capture of your desktop. If you have multiple cameras actually hooked up, you can have 2 cameras actually being composited at the same time. You can use this browser source where you essentially use a live web page as one of the inputs. Super, super flexible, really cool stuff. But it's kind of finicky. And there have been times when you open it up, it's like new version of OBS, like an hour before the episode. New version of OBS, do you want to upgrade? And you're like, yeah, sure, why not? New software is always great. And then it like breaks something in the setup because it could be a little bit finicky. And then you're like frantically trying to actually download and find the old version. And yeah, so part of our checklist now says don't upgrade OBS right before the version. We use Twitch. We use YouTube, and I think the big question is why not Twitch? Twitch is great for streaming, for engaging an audience. I think a lot of the sort of game streaming, audience that Twitch actually caters to is really there's an ephemeralness about it, where if you blink, you miss it, and there's no way to go back. But I think we knew from the get-go that we wanted to be able to create archives so that people could watch this over time. I think that's especially important considering the time zone issues that I didn't take into account from the get-go. But and so YouTube has a really nice feature that, like, when you start one of these live streams, you can create an event. It gives you an URL, and then that URL sticks with you as you do the live stream, and then afterwards it turns into the page where you can actually watch the replay of the thing. And so it creates a lot of continuity between when you do a live stream and then actually how you host it and how you make that available later. And I don't think you can quite do the same thing with Twitch. And then we have a Slack channel where we can actually help each other out. We're a pretty distributed group, and so being able to have those things to communicate with each other is really good. If you want to start doing this yourself, and I totally encourage people to start doing this. I think practicing talking in front of an audience, practicing doing this stuff, it really makes it a heck of a lot easier for me to get up on stage here, for me to get up on stage at the keynote stage, and really not sweat it. Right? I think public speaking, doing this stuff, demoing stuff, it really is something that you can practice and get better at, and it just takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort to get there, but anybody can do it. And so I think streaming like this is a great way to essentially set a schedule, start doing stuff. There may be like 2 people watching. It's okay, right? It's a good way for you to actually explore stuff, start sharing, start building an audience, and start getting more comfortable with speaking to an audience like that. But don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to sort of futz with the technical details of setting this stuff up. It is like, it'll like, oh, let me just tweak one thing. And so like, I think there's a lot of streamers that probably spend more time tweaking their streaming setup than they do streaming. It's pretty easy to get yourself into that trap. All right, and so I want to talk about burnout also. This stuff is exhausting. I mean, it doesn't, like, it's energizing while you're doing an episode, and like, you saw that, like, I don't do that much preparation for the episodes, and it shows, right? But it still takes a lot out of you. Even if you're not doing concrete prep, you're still thinking about it, you're planning in your head, you're getting ready to do it, you're sort of dry running it. While you're doing it, you're trying to stay on, you're trying to stay active, you're trying to stay engaged, right? Being very open and out there and excited about stuff is I think, one of those things that helps keep people involved with it. And then afterwards, it's just kind of like, okay, now I just want to like go collapse somewhere, right? Grab a beer and relax. Mistake I made is that there's times when I got a day job, right? So like I'll mark out TGIK on my calendar, and then like somebody will schedule a meeting immediately afterwards. I'm just like totally useless because it's like, I don't know, 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon after I sort of run a marathon, at least mentally, and it's like, well, now go be sparkly at this meeting. It's very difficult. The worst is interviews. If I've ever interviewed you after a TGIK, I apologize. Probably a pretty crappy interview at that point. Be aware of burnout and actually pace yourself if you're going to start doing this stuff. I think amongst, you'll read articles and you look at the pace of folks who do like YouTube content creation full time. It is outrageous the amount of content that they produce, the pace that they do it. There's a competition for better and better production values. I mean, it really is a bit of a rat race to actually be able to do this stuff. And so I would say don't let yourself get into that trap. And the biggest thing is to lean on other folks, for me at least. I mean, being able to trade off with other people, giving yourself permission to take a break once in a while, that has actually been huge to actually make the thing sustainable over time. All right, so what does the future hold for TGIK? Well, the Heptio office in Seattle, sadly, pour one out, is now closed. VMware consolidated us all to Bellevue. Anybody from Bellevue here? No? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say this anyways. Bellevue is a shopping mall that turned into a city. It's just culturally dead, but I'm going there 3 days a week now. No, it's actually, there's a lot of good stuff there, but there's a rivalry between sort of Seattle and Bellevue. It's kind of like between the Bay Area, between like the city and like, the South Bay or the peninsula. But where, we had the janky space that you saw earlier where like I picked up a bunch of equipment on Amazon and like pasted foam things on the wall, right? So now that all that's gone and we're going to be looking at building out a new studio space that's a little bit more professional looking. We probably don't want to overdo it, but it's going to be a little bit more professional looking than what we had before. Another thing we want to do is we want to figure out how to have guests. I love it when people are on the chat, when they're interactive. It would be even better if I could actually see them and talk to them and interact with them. But again, this is one of those things where futzing with the technology around this stuff is actually really difficult. You'd think that there would be sort of a plugin for OBS for doing sort of real-time video interaction, and there's just not. Like state of the art here is that you run Skype in another window and you actually sort of try and capture that, and if you move the window, the whole thing like is pretty low tech in terms of the way that people do these things. So I think we'd probably look at doing something like Zoom. But it's definitely going to be a little bit tricky to set up, and so we have to spend some time figuring that out. And then finally, like I think this type of engagement has been working well for us in terms of building a community, exploring new things. And so one of the things that we're looking at now is doing a podcast that's a little bit of a spin-off, or at least inspired in some ways by TGIK. We're calling it the Kubelets. It's being led by Carlesia, who's a longtime member of the Go community, getting more involved in Kubernetes, and is a member of the Valero team. And along with some of our field engineers, folks who actually go on site with customers. And the idea behind the Kubelets is that we want it to be sort of back a little bit to that TGIK, episode 1, where it's like, let's just start covering core concepts, have a discussion about it, sort of a little bit of a back to basics sort of beginner type of thing. I think that's the idea. It's still evolving, we're still figuring it out. So stay tuned for that. We don't have a schedule yet. We're still figuring out some of those nitty-gritty technical details, but we're gonna get there. So with that, that's all I got. Thank you everybody for listening to me ramble on, and I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I'd love to be able to answer it. Nobody shouted anything out at me. But, except for Caslin, who raised her hand, yeah.
We have a few minutes for questions, and so if you'd like to ask anything, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over to you. Yeah.
Oh.
Any questions?
Reminder for the next, oh. You can yell it out and I'll repeat it too, either way.
I don't have really a question, just to say thank you, because I came here to thank you, because I learned a lot from Kubernetes by just watching the show, which is my Friday evening, so I don't have time, so watching it on Saturday. So I really have a question.
Well, thank you very much. So this is awkward for me to repeat. The gentleman was just thanking me for Kubernetes and saying he's one of those that can't watch it live and ends up watching it Saturday morning. But yeah, thanks for being a part of it, because I think this really is, more than just me talking at a wall. It really is the folks who get involved and hang out with us, and even if you're not doing it live, you're still a part of it. So thank you. Question here?
Thanks again for the time that you put aside for putting this show together. Is there a plan for you to revisit some of the older episodes and just like the technology moves so fast, things are new now.
Yeah.
And is there a way you can just revisit some of those?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. So so let's take Istio for example. Right? I did an episode on Istio when we were all like, service what? Right? And it was really like, like what is this thing? What does it do? It was Istio like version like -3, and like Istio has come a long way since then. There's a lot going on with Istio now. It's a bigger project. Knative is another thing. It's continuing to march forward. All of the serverless platforms that I looked at. Yeah, I'd love to actually pick projects and actually do a redo on them. It's one of those like that sort of kid in the candy store. There's too many choices, right? And like I think it's always difficult. Like, do I want to pick something interesting and new that's taking the community in a new direction, or maybe revisit some of these things? I think one of the things that I try and be topical, right? So it's like when everybody's interested in it, that's when I want to do an episode on it. And so there's a lot of great content on what Istio is out there. So I'm not sure that I have the expertise to go as deep as somebody who's like living and breathing Istio every day. I think one of the examples of sort of being topical that I want to bring up is I did an episode on securing the Kubernetes dashboard, talking about how do you actually run the dashboard behind in a secure way, and talking about sort of what the security considerations were there. This was right after there was a news article hit that Tesla was hacked through exposing a dashboard, and people were able to read sort of AWS secrets and, again, launch cryptocurrency mining, because that's apparently what you do these days. And so that was really popular because it was topical, and I turned it into a blog post that was pretty successful too. So yeah, it's always trying to weigh those. But yeah, definitely something I've been thinking about. All right, I think, are we running down the clock?
Time for one more.
Oh, one more, okay.
Do you have a favorite episode?
Do I have a favorite episode? I don't know. I gotta be, that one where I opened it up and we got hacked. Like, it was horrible, and I feel so bad for the project that I was showing off. But like, if it's anything of like make mistakes, and it's like it's okay to totally, like, I think that was kind of fun. I mean, anytime when I have to really dance and keep track of stuff. I also think I did like the episode around the dashboard stuff. I put a little bit more time to prep into that, really sort of wanted to have a full solution. I felt like that was something that is one of my favorites, because I think it brought sort of real actionable knowledge to people versus like, let's just hang out and learn some stuff. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody for coming and listening to me ramble on. I appreciate it.